Hi, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am Dr. Brian Ng from the Department of Anesthesia in NUH. And this morning, I will be your chairperson. Before we begin, I'd just like to highlight a few house rules. Firstly, may I request that all participants be muted to enable the speakers to present without interruption. There will be a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. So you may send your questions via the question and answer option at the bottom of your screen. This webinar will be recorded. So for those who would want to have CME points after this, do have your full name in the Zoom login and just ensure you stay for the full session for you to be awarded your 1 CME point. Okay, so the theme for this morning is on environmental sustainability, which, given the floods we faced in the past week, is quite thematic. So today we are pleased to have with us on the panel distinguished specialists who will bring us through steps we are taking in NUH towards environmental sustainability, from the departmental level to the hospital and community level. And finally, we'll look at what's going on at the country level to see what the future of sustainable healthcare might look like. Our first speaker this morning is Dr. Po Pei Ki. He joined us from the UK as an associate consultant maybe about 1.5 years ago. And in NUH, all ACs must do a quality improvement project as part of their promotion criteria from AC to C. And you can imagine how skeptical I was when he approached me one day to tell me about his QI project, that he wanted to reduce our department's dependence on the use of desflurane. My words of advice to him then was, please don't bet your promotion on us breaking our dependence on our favorite desflurane. So this is his story about how he proved me wrong. Becky?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Yeah, thanks for inviting me to speak on this talk. I'm really glad that Brian allowed me to do this QIP, because I think over the last year we've actually worked tremendously hard on looking to reduce our dependence and use of desflurane. Something which is I think really difficult to do, because it requires a change in behavior in our daily practice. So with that, I also would like to thank the rest of the QIP team who's helped me along with this journey. So I think we'll proceed along with the talk. So what I'm going to be talking about this morning, I'm going to briefly talk about the history of volatile anesthetics and how we've ended up in the situation of where we are now with Sevo and desflurane being the two most popular choices of anesthetics. We're going to look at global warming potentials, and to see if it's an accurate comparison between the volatile agents and whether there are any other forms of measurements and comparisons, especially with regards to things such as propofol, which are not gases in their own right. We'll share our approach as to how we try to reduce our desflurane usage, and we're going to look at cost comparison studies to see if Tiva anesthetic is indeed cost efficient and beneficial. And last but not least, if we have time, we'll talk a little bit about ideal fresh gas flows based on a study that was published about a year ago. So what fresh gas flows you should run during Tiva anesthetic. So how did sevoflurane and desflurane come about? Well, I think to begin with, we have to look all the way back to the days of ether. And this goes back to 1842 when a Georgian physician by the name of Crawford Willison John became the first doctor to use ether as a general anesthetic to remove a tumor from the neck of his patient. Long did not publish the results of his study all the way until 1948. And by that time, Boston dentist William T.G. Morton had already gained fame with his first publicly demonstrated use of ether as an effective surgical anesthetic. Unfortunately, many of the inhalational anesthetics developed subsequently were rather flammable. And this was due to the presence of multiple CH bonds in the compound, as evidenced in fossil fuels and hydrocarbons. Fluorinated hydrocarbons was not an attractive option at that time because fluorine was extremely reactive. But this changed with the advent of the Manhattan Project during World War II, where scientists were looking at the use of fluorine to try to enrich uranium-235 from uranium oxide to form uranium hexafluoride. After the war, scientists began to explore the possible use of fluorinated hydrocarbons as anesthetics. And being the most electronegative halogen on the periodic table, fluorine was extremely reactive. But once it bonded with a carbon atom, it became a very stable compound, rendering it less flammable. The downside to this is that they became much more difficult to break down, thus persisting in the atmosphere for longer periods of time, causing extensive greenhouse effects. So when we talk about climate change, there are two things that we need to distinguish. One is ozone layer depletion, whereby this is actually more to do with the detrimental health effects of UV radiation reaching our planet, causing increased rates of skin cancer. So this is due to the release of chlorine atoms into the atmosphere, which then react to the ozone to break it down. So when we talk about anesthetics, this will include compounds with chlorine or bromine atoms in them, such as isoflurane, enflurane, and halothane. Nitrous oxide also has some ozone layer depleting potential. And that's because nitrous oxide is able to react with oxygen radicals in the atmosphere to form nitric oxide, which then further reacts with ozone to form nitrogen dioxide and the release of more oxygen-free radicals. And the whole process continues on. When you talk about greenhouse effects and global warming, this goes back to infrared radiation and absorption. So all heteronuclear gases, that is gases that possess more than one type of atom, they are infrared active, meaning that they vibrate, rotate, and stretch in the presence of infrared radiation. So this includes compounds such as CO2, which we are well aware of, as well as compounds such as water vapor. This is the very principle of infrared spectroscopy, which is used to measure end-tidal CO2 in waveform capnography. The molecules absorb this infrared radiation and subsequently emit this energy, leading to heat retention on our planet. So how do we compare, or how do we measure the global warming potential of a substance? Well, we have this measure called GWP. If you look at this table, which I'm sure you've seen at some point in time, the global warming potential of desflurane compared to sevoflurane is about 20 times when you look at the GWP over 100 years. To define global warming GWP, so that is the heat absorbed by any greenhouse gas in the atmosphere as a multiple of the heat that would be absorbed by the same mass of carbon dioxide. And this depends on the type of gas as well as the time frame in which it persists in the atmosphere. So these figures are provided by Subek and Anderson, who was a atmospheric chemical scientist who looked at this the GWP of these compounds back in 2013. The figures for nitrous oxide come from the IPCC fifth assessment report. These are subsequently the most recent GWP figures from the latest IPCC sixth assessment report that was just published in September last year. And you can see that the figures are roughly similar. They do change when they're remeasured, but they don't change significantly. The figures for sevoflurane is a little bit contentious, and Subek and Anderson argues that the latest figures used by the IPCC of 195 is not very accurate because they've overestimated the atmospheric persistence and lifetime of sevoflurane. So he came to a figure of 127, but tried to replicate the same process with the ones used by the IPCC, and came to a figure of 144. So that's the little bit of discrepancy there, but these are the latest figures, which do not vary much from the traditional ones. So why is it that sevoflurane and desflurane have such different persistence and lifespans in the atmosphere? Well, that's primarily because of two reasons. One is that the CH2F bond in sevoflurane is much easier to break down compared to the CF2H group here in desflurane. And it's also partly because the carbon molecule on the other side of sevoflurane here is attached to two carbon atoms, two CF3 groups, whereas the one on desflurane side is attached to it should be the other way around actually, but yeah, it's attached to two others. I think this figure is studied the other way around. So what's the scale of the problem? Well, healthcare itself contributes about 4.6% of greenhouse gas emissions. The figures vary depending on the country at which you're looking at. If you look at a healthcare system in India, the healthcare itself contributes to about 1.5%. And on the other end of the spectrum, when you look at the US, that goes to about 7.6 to 10% of the country's greenhouse gas emissions. Theaters itself is 3 to 6 times more energy intensive than hospitals as a whole, and that's because of the need for scrupulous need for sterility, theater ventilation, air conditioning, as well as expensive sterilized surgical equipment. The anesthetic gases contribute to about 5% of hospital admissions, and when you look at the global warming as a whole, the volatile agents contribute to about 1.1% of global warming, with 80% coming from desflurane. Medical nitrous oxide contributes about 0.1% of global warming as well. We tried to look at how much CO2e we are emanating from our use of desflurane, sevoflurane, and nitrous oxide in NUH, and that comes up to nearly 4 tons, or 4 million kilograms of CO2 equivalents. When you compare that to the amount of CO2 emissions emitted from waste incineration from all the waste in NUH, that comes up to 3 kilotons of CO2e, with 4 kilotons generated, but we recover 1 kiloton of energy back from the incineration of these of our waste. So it's almost crazy to think about it, but the amount of CO2e that we generate from anesthetic gases actually is more than the amount of CO2e that we generate from the waste that we incinerate in hospitals. how to put it further into perspective? Well, if you look at a canister of sevoflurane, then that would be equivalent to driving from Singapore to KL. But when you look at the one canister of desflurane, that's equivalent to driving from Singapore all the way to Shenyang, which is sitting on the border of Pyongyang and North Korea. In fact, the distance is so vast that Google Maps doesn't allow me to plot a driving route all the way there. But that's that is the significant difference of between the two compounds. To further illustrate this, there was a study done which was published on the Lancet Planetary Health by the Canadians, and they looked at the impact of surgery on global climate, and they compared 3 different health systems. So the hospitals compared here were Vancouver General, University of Minnesota Medical Center, as well as John Radcliffe in Oxford. So the first 2 centers use primarily desflurane as well as some sevoflurane anesthetic, whereas John Radcliffe did not use any desflurane. And you can look from the table, what you can see is that the amount of CO2e generated from Vancouver and Minnesota is much more than what John Radcliffe produces. And this is despite the fact that John Radcliffe Hospital had 1.5 times the caseload, so 30,000 cases annually compared to 20,000 cases in the other 2 hospitals. And when you look at the proportion of emissions of anesthetics gases and their contribution to CO2e, when you compare it to the emissions from theaters, it forms more than 50% in the 2 centers compared to John Radcliffe. Of course, we have to take note of the fact that John Radcliffe is a much older hospital, and the energy that's required to heat it up, since it's a hospital that retains heat less efficiently, is significantly more. But is global warming potential the best comparison? I wouldn't say so, and I think that's because when you use it to compare drugs such as desflurane and sevoflurane, which have different potencies, then I think global warming potential becomes an underrepresentation of the impact of desflurane. But so we're looking more towards life cycle assessments and MAC hours to compare different anesthetic agents. So this looks at the CO2 emissions from cradle to grave, accounting for the production, transport, usage, and the decomposition of the drug. It also allows us to compare drugs that are not gases, such as propofol that's used in TIVA anesthetic. So this was a study by Hu and Dr. Tom Pierce, who is the environmental advisor to the Royal College of Anaesthetists. And they looked at they compared the carbon footprint of general anesthetics and tried to model it using life cycle assessment software. And they looked at the production as well as the CO2 that's generated from these compounds once they're released into the atmosphere. And they looked at it based on different scenarios in the US, in the UK, at different flow rates. And from what you can see, they've also modeled the life cycle assessment for propofol as well, which is significantly lower than the other 2 compounds. They also modeled the life cycle assessment based on the use of vapor capture technology to look to see if this actually significantly reduces the CO2 emissions from the use of sevoflurane and desflurane if you were to recycle these anesthetic gases. So I believe that apart from Sage Tech, which reports a 70% efficiency when it comes to recycling of anesthetic gases. Baxter is doing a similar project as well to try to recycle their use of desflurane. So what did they find? Well, they looked at it and compared it with MAC hours. And what they found was that, when we run propofol Tiva anesthetic, that comes up to a figure of about 1.013 kilograms of CO2e per MAC hour. Comparing that with the anesthetic gases, when you run sevoflurane at 1 liter per minute, then that comes out to about 3 kilograms of CO2e per MAC hour. And when you look at desflurane at 1 liter per minute, that comes out to about 80.5 kilograms of CO2e per MAC hour. So that's more than 20 times the amount of sevoflurane, and that's partially because 3 times more is needed to keep our patients asleep. Of course, people run desflurane at much lower flow, such as 0.5 liters per minute, and that will come down to about 40 kilograms of CO2e per MAC hour. What about with the use of vapor capture technology? Well, they look to see if you were to recycle these gases and use it for a further cycle, then that will bring your CO2e down to about 2 kilograms for sevoflurane and 52 kilograms for desflurane. Of course, this looks at the recycling of the gases for use for a further time, and it may be quite possible that these gases may be used for more times than just once. So that itself may reduce the impact of these gases more. But I think more studies need to be done to look at the impact of vapor capture technology. We also have to note that at this moment, vapor capture technology is still in its infancy stage, and these gases still have to be collected and shipped back to Europe in order for it to be recycled. And at the moment, the recycled gases are not approved for use by the EU regulatory body. So they are at the moment sitting on shelves pending the approval of the use of these compounds. So what did we do at NUH to try to reduce our use of desflurane? Well, to start off with, we did talks like the one we are doing now to educate our department about the significant difference of these compounds. So we published newsletters highlighting to the department the extent of the differences and how much of an impact when it comes to when it comes to driving, how many kilometers you can actually drive with the difference between these two compounds. We also invited speakers from overseas. So we invited Dr. Tom Pierce to look at the difference between the use of desflurane, sevoflurane, and what other steps we can take on a day-to-day basis to reduce our CO2e. But I think beyond that, we also started a Greening the OT campaign to try to create a culture of change, and also to let people know that we are serious about climate change, and that we're not just targeting desflurane. I think this whole thing about wanting to make a difference in terms of reducing our carbon footprint, that goes beyond desflurane, and we have to look at other things such as recycling, as well as changing our day-to-day behavior to try to reduce our carbon footprint as much as possible. Besides that, we looked at true indications for the use of desflurane. Although we're not prescriptive, to tell the department what desflurane should and should not be actually used for, but we shared with them articles on when desflurane will actually be useful. So this was a paper published back in 2020 on the use of desflurane. And I think, it provides a rapid emergence and it's more pronounced in, patients who are obese and after, a period of prolonged surgical anesthesia. The study also looked at the meta-analysis of the two different compounds. And what they showed here was that, when you look at the emergence between desflurane and sevoflurane or that of propofol, the difference is, in terms of, a few minutes. And and a lot of the times, actually, it's not very much significant. And the paper goes on to say that, perhaps, what we're treating here is, the tangible benefits that we see. We're perhaps not treating the patients, but rather treating ourselves. When we look at the wake-up profiles between these two agents. But interestingly of note, what the study also showed was that, when you look at the PACU discharge times, the use of desflurane is associated with a slightly increased length of stay in PACU, although again, it's not very much significant. It goes down to a few minutes. But when we looked at our QIP pre and post, what we found was that, after reduction in desflurane, PACU times seem to have gone down on an average of about 8 to 9 minutes. And this may be due to the reduction in emergence delirium that you see as you transition from desflurane to sevo or propofol anesthetics. Other interventions that we did included the use of, hourly volatile impact stickers that we paste on the anesthetic machines to remind our clinicians of, how many kilometers, you could travel per hour of anesthetic and what's the cost difference between running these two different compounds. We also shared, articles on the use of sevoflurane and that, running it at low flows is safe, especially with the use of modern day CO2 absorbents, which have less sodium hydroxide and potassium hydroxide. And finally, I think, switching from desflurane to sevoflurane or propofol with slower wake-up profiles is something that, requires a behavioral change and it's not easy. So when you look at the days of, ether anesthetic, the induction process and the wake-up process is very much similar. They go off to sleep slower, but, they wake up, tapering off the anesthetic and waking them up to achieve a quick wake up is a similar process to flying, and it's a gradual process. So, we tell our clinicians that actually what you have to do when you use sevo and propofol is you have to taper it down early. And because we don't have to maintain a MAC of 1 all the way to the end of surgery, because MAC of 1 is actually MAC movement. And you can actually taper it down to levels above MAC awake, which is 0.3 MAC before you wake your patients up. And I think, people who have used isoflurane in the past are quite familiar with this concept. But, there are many ways of, waking a patient up. And I think, when one of the things, which I mentioned about earlier on, is that when you wake a patient up and turn off the anesthetics very quickly at the end, what we call a penetration or a slam down maneuver, as with flying, it leads to a very bumpy landing. And as a result, what you can get is something quite similar to emergence delirium. I think patients wake up smoother when you taper off the anesthetic slowly. So was there a change in practice since our QIP? So this was before. So before our QIP, 50% of the department used sevoflurane, with 30% using DAS and 18% using propofol TIVA anesthetics. And 6 months afterwards, we looked at a 1 week snapshot again, and we can see a drastic difference and a reduction in the use of desflurane compared to CO and propofol. So we track the use of desflurane as well on monthly usage, and on average, we think that over the last 10 months, our use of sevoflurane has more than halved. Our use of desflurane has more than halved during that period of time. When you looked at sevoflurane, we expected a increase in the use of sevoflurane actually, but I think with us telling people that it's actually safe to run sevoflurane at lower flows, compared to the time back in the 90s when Abbott first recommended sevoflurane to be run at 2 liters per minute. Then what we actually surprisingly saw was a reduction in our use of sevoflurane over the last 10 months. And in terms of propofol, that's seen an increase over the same period of time. It's difficult to compare the amount of propofol used during this period because this actually looks at propofol usage in the whole hospital. So this includes usage in ICU, and with COVID surges, it becomes much more difficult. So this was our use in back in 2019, and we have here usage in an average UK hospital, which was a study that was looked at 175 hospitals in the UK, where they asked for their usage of sevoflurane and desflurane via the Freedom of Information Act back in 2018, 2019. And this was the average use of sevo and des over a period of a year. We asked for similar data from our pharmacy, as well as data from 2 institutions in Singapore as well, Hospital A and Hospital B. And really what we noticed was that, in NUH, we were using quite a lot of desflurane in comparison to the other hospitals. So what have we achieved over the last year? So we've seen a reduction in our usage of desflurane, as well as a small decrease in our usage of sevoflurane as well. So hopefully a step better towards reducing our carbon footprint and moving more in line with other institutions. So what are our savings over this period? Over the last 10 months, when you take into account the amount of desflurane saved, as well as the increase in TIVA used, then financially we've actually saved about nearly 300,000 Singapore dollars. Environmentally, what's that translated to then? So when we calculated it, our impact, the impact saved is about 660,000 kilograms of CO2e. And when you try to, it's difficult to, I think that figure doesn't become meaningful until you translate it into something that we can all relate to. So when you look at a small size car with an efficiency of 130 grams of CO2 per kilometer, then that translates to about 5.14 million kilometers. Now, what's that? I think that itself is a very big figure. But what does that translate to? So that translates to about 128 times, around planet Earth, or removing 294 cars off the roads in Singapore, assuming that one car travels about 17,500 kilometers annually in Singapore on average. Are there any other interventions you can do? Yes, there are. But these were steps that we did not take. But one that you might perhaps consider in your own institution. So this is a Rigmore Hospital, where they've actually gone to hide or keep the desflurane vaporizers centrally And if you want to if you wanted to use the desflurane vaporizers, then you had to specifically request or sign out for it in order to use the drug. But and I think from what they showed from this exercise, what they showed was that the power of laziness as well as convenience when you have a desflurane vaporizer on your machine. So we did not go down this route because there was some resistance within the department, and also we didn't want to alienate everyone in the department. And I think rather than alienating everybody, we thought why not we want to achieve more benefits. We want to go beyond desflurane. So let's start off with the things that we're doing and see how we are and see where we are at. And I'm quite glad over that period of time we've managed to halve our use of DES. I believe other institutions like Sengkang, for example, have gone down this route of removing the vaporizers, and it'll be interesting to see their reduction in the use as well over the last year. Further interventions that we can take will include the introduction of examination questions about the impact of anesthetics on our day-to-day practice. So this was a final FRCA question that I got back when I did my final FRCA, and I mean, although I was slightly stumped by the question, I think it goes to show the importance that Western countries pay with regards to climate change. And I think if we are to raise the awareness of this issue, then we need to do something similar as well in Singapore. And I won't be surprised if one of these questions came up in the Part B or Part C exams over the next few years. Beyond that, we need to look at changing our curriculum as well. And if you look at the latest edition of Peck and Williams, or now Peck and Harris in pharmacology, there are now sections on environmental impacts, global warming potentials in the latest edition of these books. So I think as we move towards change, we need to look at how we are educating our younger anesthetists. Moving on, are there any benefits to using a sevoflurane or propofol anesthetics, and which anesthetics is actually cheaper? Well, this was a multi-center study that looked at the comparison of Sevo and propofol, but this study goes all the way back to 1999 in the BJA, and they looked at the use of these two compounds in 4 different countries. And what they found here was that propofol anesthetic, or TIVA, was associated with a higher cost of about $31.90 compared to $19.70 when you look at running sevoflurane anesthetic. 20 years later down the line, the most recent study published by the Americans. So now what they looked at was propofol-based anesthesia as well as inhalational-based anesthesia in their own institution, which used 66% Sevo and 16% desflurane, with the rest coming from TIVA. So when they modeled it for an inpatient setting and an outpatient day surgery setting, and when they included all the drugs such as muscle relaxants, the time stayed in PACU, as well as the extra drugs that are needed for post-op nausea vomiting, especially with inhalational-based anesthetics, what they found was that actually propofol-based anesthesia is associated with an $11 to $12 reduction in the cost of the whole anesthetic journey. I think to further demonstrate this, what we've done is to try to calculate it ourselves. So this is the anesthetic impact calculator that you can find in the App Store, and this has been validated and published in Anesthesia. and it allows you to calculate, your impact of anesthesia, not just from a CO2e point of view, but you can also put in the cost of a canister of sevoflurane and of desflurane. Just to highlight, that actually bottle of sevoflurane and desflurane costs more than $400. And NUH itself spends more than $1.2 million on volatiles a year. So we use that to calculate, our emissions from inhalationals per hour of anesthetics. And then we looked at, the price of TIVA over 2 hours, because I think that's on average the most common anesthetic that you're going to be delivering. And when we modeled that based on 2 hours of anesthetics delivering 1,750 milligrams of propofol, which is, I think, quite conventional. I mean, I use much less propofol over that same period. When you're using 2 syringes, a spike, and a line extension, anti-reflux valves, 3-way taps, or if you're using a dedicated TIVA line, as well as a BIS strip, then we calculated the cost of the setup being $39.87 or $59.85 over 2 hours. This comes down to this is the cost of the whole thing when you run it at over a period of 2 hours. So which is cheaper? So when you compare it at cost per MAC hour, when you're looking only at cost to the hospital, then TIVA anesthetics, you're looking at about $6-7, depending on the type of setup that you're using. When you're running sevoflurane at 1 liters per minute, and desflurane at 1 liters per minute, that comes up to about nearly $10 for sevoflurane and $30 for desflurane. If you include the cost of the hospital plus the patient itself, then the use of TIVA anesthetic becomes significantly more. And that's because, things such as the consumables of the TIVA line, as well as the BIS strip of $25, that then, pushes up your price much more significantly. And TIVA becomes more expensive than sevoflurane, but, possibly less than desflurane. Again, that depends on how high you're running your TIVA anesthetics and what sort of flows you're running your desflurane. If you're running at much lower flows, then your cost is gonna half during that period. So I think TIVA is roughly comparable to desflurane or cheaper, but again, it all depends on the flows that you're talking about. But I think as we move further down the future, one of the things with the advent of onco-anesthesia, we're going to see more use of propofol over the next few decades. The use of inhalational anesthetics has been reported to promote tumorigenic growth factors such as hypoxia-inducible factors, insulin-like growth factors, as well as they decrease your balance of Th1 and Th2 natural killer cells in your body. Thus, they may promote the micrometastases and promote tumor growth, whereas propofol does the opposite of that. So I think over the next few years, you're probably going to be looking to use more propofol-based anesthesia. That being said, propofol anesthesia is associated with problems. It has a high potential for bioaccumulation, and it's toxic to marine life. And therefore, we need to think about how we dispose of this product carefully. And I think the best way forward will be to dispose of it in your sharps bin. Make sure that it's incinerated properly. What sort of gas flows should you be running if you're running TIVA anesthetic? This was a study that was published by George Zhong and Tim McCulloch from the University of Sydney back in 2020. And what they found was that when you run high flow, high fresh gas flows of 4 to 6 liters or 4 liters per minute of anesthetics, then because of the reduced efficiency in terms of soda lime absorption of CO2, what you're going to be doing is using less CO2 absorbent, although you're going to be using more oxygen and air. But when you run it at a fresh gas, when you run it at FiO2 of 30%, what they found was that, when you look at the balance between the two, actually you're going to be saving some CO2 equivalents running at 4 liters per minute. And when you run it at 6 liters per minute, that's associated with quite a significant reduction in cost. And you might save the department some money. Following this paper, I think many people have gone on to change their practice, but in 2021, there was a response to this article from a group in Melbourne, headed by Forbes McCain, who's quite interested in environmental anesthesia, and their argument was that actually the study that was published was based on a GWP of oxygen being half that, which is 0.7 kilograms of CO2 that's being which was used in the calculations, rather than 1.45. Given that Australia is a country that relies a lot on coal for its production of energy, and therefore the production of medical oxygen is actually associated with more CO2 than what was originally calculated. So they then also commented that the FiO2 is of 30% is the bare minimum, and is probably not a good representation of what we're going to be running, what we're running on a day-to-day basis, and that it's going to be beneficial. 4 to 6 liters is probably more beneficial in countries such as Europe, where the green emissions factor is much lower compared to somewhere like Australia or China. So, but they did not mention about what sort of flows should be ideal. So, but we've gone on to calculate the flows ourselves, modeling it based on the GWP of the updated GWP of oxygen that's been published, and what we found was that if you look at somewhere like Singapore, and accounting for the change in the grid emissions factor, I think fresh gas flows of 2 liters per minute is going to be associated with less CO2 emitted. When you're looking from a cost perspective, without too much damage to the environment, then you're going to be looking at 4 liters per minute. This changes depending on the FiO2 in which you're targeting, whether it's 30, 40, or 50%. But I think in the grand scheme of things, when you're looking at 28% usage of TIVA in an institution such as ours, the amount of CO2e that you're going to be saving and the cost is going to be negligible when you compare it to things such as reduction in death flow rate. But nevertheless, I think this can hopefully guide our practice further forward. But I think as we move more towards propofol-based anesthesia, really what we should be thinking about is perhaps the use of non-circle systems moving forward. So how are we going to get to net zero by 2050? This is a poster an article that was published by the World Federation of Society of Anesthesiologists. And really what they recommend is a wholehearted approach that, that looks at, not just our use of more environmentally preferable medications, which is, highlighted here in the second statement, but, changing our day-to-day practice, and as well as, taking the step and leading environmental change in the organization and institution that we work in. As they say, it will take collective action to bend the climate change curve. And I think, moving forward, we need to look at, changing our behaviors, starting from, the reduction of death flow rate, but looking into changing our diet, as well as taking public transport, using only what we need on a day-to-day practice. Finally, on to my last slide now. When I did this QIP, somebody said to one of the facilitators said to me, is the reduction of desflurane, does it qualify as a quality improvement project? And is it of any benefit to healthcare? And I'm quite glad that one of my fellow participants actually said that actually it is, and it's no different to rationalizing antibiotics, because we're not seeing the problem now, and it probably won't affect us at this moment, although we are starting to see the effects of climate change. But we're going to see this problem much further down the line, and it's going to be affecting your kids and my kids and the future generation. So I hope that we can work in more meaningful ways to reduce our usage of anesthetic agents, as well as reduce our usage of desflurane. So with that, I've come to the end of my presentation. Thanks again.
Thanks, Becky. People who know me well will tell you like how stubborn I am and how I hate being wrong. And so I'll say this once and just once. Becky, thank you. You are right. I was wrong. And please don't ever quote me on this, especially to my wife. So we will move on now to our next speaker. Just remember, you can start posting your questions to the Q&A chat. And our next speaker is Dr. Wong Wing Ho, my previous boss and still my boss, who is the group director of anesthesia within NUHS. And he's also concurrently appointed to AHS as AHS OT chairman, and is also in another committee looking at the redevelopment of AH. So he will tell us now about how AH has been going about trying to green the hospital. Wing Ho.
Hi, good morning, Wing Ho, and thank you for having me today. I'm going to share the green efforts that AH has taken and will be undertaking as we move towards 2028 when our new campus is up. So just taking a step backwards, of course, we all heard of climate change and how this has impacted on us. So carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, they've all been existent for a long time. And they do have a useful function in keeping our nights warm. Instead of having our temperature plummeting at night, they help to retain some of the heat from the sun. However, too much of a good thing is bad. So since the industrial age in the late 18th century, global warming has started, and till now, 1 degree Celsius rise in average global temperature has been experienced. And this is due to lots more CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide that has been released into our atmosphere through human activities, through fossil fuel usage and large-scale agriculture. And that, of course, leads to all the trouble that we have now been experiencing: melting ice sheets, glaciers, rising sea levels, extreme weather patterns. And because of all this, the world has set up and taken action. So you may have heard of the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement. So this Kyoto Protocol was ratified in 2005, and the protocol actually only required developed nations to reduce emissions, and this is a legally binding agreement. However, this has been superseded by the Paris Agreement that was signed in November 2016. And in this agreement, I think almost all nations in the world, quite a the vast majority has actually signed on to it, including Singapore. And the goal is to limit global temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. So Singapore, being a signatory to all these agreements, has then come up with our very own Singapore Green Plan 2030, and that was done in 2 years ago. Yeah. And amongst the themes that have been addressed in this green plan includes city in nature. So of which we aim to plant 1 million more trees by 2030. We also have this sustainable living. The government is going to encourage people to take public transport, 75% by 2030. And to also encourage citizens to reduce waste and consumption, reduce the amount of waste to the landfill by 20% by 2026 and 30% by 2030. Coming to the energy reset, the government will also be encouraging cleaner energy vehicles, greener infrastructure and buildings. Also, they will be increasing the use of green energy such as solar power. You must have heard of this project that will import solar power all the way from Northern Territories in Australia via a 4,200 kilometer subsea cable to Singapore somewhere in the next 10 years or so. So that's green energy. And in the resilient future segment, there is this portion on safeguarding food security and aiming to produce 30% of our nutritional needs by 2030. And there is also an aim to keep Singapore cool by using cool paint and increasing greenery. So with this in mind, public healthcare, being an arm of the government, has started to draw up plans to meet green targets. I note here that KTPH is one of the 4 hospitals in Southeast Asia to take part in the UN Race to Zero campaign by 2050. And on the right side of this newspaper cutting, you can see solar panels that were put up by Changi General since 2017. So we can see that our public health institutions have already started on this green journey. And so what has AH been doing? So the present incarnation of AH just took place like 3+ years ago when the present management and staff came on board. And so it's a relatively young hospital in that sense. So last year, somewhere in June, our COO decided, in view of the Go Green plan, to start a Go Green group in AH. Our aims would be to create awareness, to look into waste and recycling, look into greenery, mobility, the use of energy and water, and as well as the built environment, in particular, the new campus that's coming up in 2028. So of all these aims, I think awareness is most important. This war cannot be fought just by the generals, but the troops on the ground are very well needed to make this a success. So as many people to be on board would be the key to the success of this green plan. So in our group, we have about 35 members since June last year, and they come from very diverse places in the hospital, including doctors, nurses, allied health, admin staff. And so each of us in our domains, we would champion this green cause and hope to spread the message. The message is also spread via internet information dissemination, and we do have regular recruitment drives. So this is just one example of what we advertise on our intranet, and along the way, I think the group has grown. Now, specifically looking into waste and recycling, we break them down into food, plastic, paper, and e-waste. We have a goal to reduce the total food waste in AH, and in particular to reduce the food waste sent to the incinerator by 50% by the year 2030. In terms of the total waste in general, we have aimed to reduce it by 10% by 2022 and 25% by 2025. And out of the waste that we generate, we would like to recycle 10% of it by 2022, 25% by 2025, and 60% by 2030. Very ambitious goal, but we will try. Coming to food waste, specifically clean food waste, which is things like food peel, vegetables that cannot, parts of vegetables that cannot be used, part of the fruit that may be rotten. This takes up 1/3 of the total food waste that we generate. And since the end of last year, we have signed a contract with a local company to recycle clean food waste. The rest of the 2/3 of the food waste are brown food waste. That means cooked food. There is a plan to turn them into compost using biodigesters. However, this is still in discussion. Now, how do we recycle clean food waste? So this particular insect, the black soldier fly, is a very important part of the equation. The adults essentially just lay eggs. They don't feed at all. And then when they can lay up to like 500 eggs each time. And we have this hungry larva. And this larva can feed quite a lot, up to 4 times their weight per day. And we turn them into processed larvae, and that's on the right-hand side. And this processed larva can be fed to poultry, can be fed to fish. The fresh, which is the waste product of the larva, are then turned into organic fertilizer. So this is a kind of a circular economy where we recycle them instead of throwing our food waste into the incinerator and produce more CO2. It also helps in the meeting our target of getting 30% of our nutritional needs in Singapore by 2030. Turning to trees. So we have about 1,000 trees in the AH campus, and these trees provide very useful service in temperature regulation. This is a natural way of carbon sequestration, water filtering, stormwater interception functions. However, during our campus redevelopment, inevitably some of these trees will be felled, and instead of sending them to the incinerator and releasing the carbon that was captured, we intend to upcycle them and repurpose them into useful products. There are many ways to recycle these trees. They can be made into furniture, planter boxes, acoustic walls, and so on and so forth. So if you look at this, this has been done in Jurong Lake Gardens. Felled trees have been made into structure, outdoor shelter, as well as furniture. And in another location, they have been made into wall cladding. Now we come to plastics. Only 10% of plastics produced are recycled. So what happens to the other 90%? The other 90% will end up in landfills, end up in incinerator producing CO2, or in our waterways. And as this caption shows, they last forever. So what do we do in AH? We try to replace them with biodegradables. We have started to ban bottled waters, disposable cups and cutleries, starting with the staff area, and slowly we will go towards the patient areas as well. Why do we have a problem with plastics? Well, they are made from fossil fuels. That adds to the greenhouse effect. They do harm to wildlife when, say, marine animals, birds ingest them and cause intestinal obstruction. When plastic breaks down, they go and become micro and nanoplastics. They get into our food chain, and whether they do harm to us, the jury is still out at this point in time. But they are known to have chemicals that can be leached out, such as bisphenol A, that are endocrine disruptors and have estrogen-like effects. So the change begins with me. And I am sure in many of our institutions, we have started to segregate plastics and paper waste and send it to companies for them to recycle. And that's also been done in AH. We also have this change from disposable to reusables. So we have made our cups very visible this way. As you can see from the picture, it is convenient to use, and it does reinforce the message not to use disposables and to use reusables. In addition to that, our cutlery, there are no more plastic cutleries in the OT. Every day, in cooperation with the kitchen unit, they actually come once a day to change the use and give us new cutleries. So a change of mindset is needed, but I think our staff have adapted very well, no complaints so far. The next step is to change the bento box into something, the plastic bento box into something like this. Still in progress, we are in discussion. And we want to spread the message to the wider community. So away from the OT into our boardroom, this is what you see. This not reusable cups, bottles, no more plastic bottles for our vendors, visitors, and AH colleagues. E-waste, nowadays we can't live without our electronic devices. So we have put this in at the end of last year, and after 2 months, we actually collected 70 kilo of e-waste to be recycled. And this is placed in a very prominent area in the atrium. So not just is it convenient, but I hope it does spread the message. Now, going on to greenery, we would like to have a biophilic environment for staff, patients, and that would promote physical and mental well-being. The biophilic environment has very useful functions. It has an island heat mitigation effect. It attenuates noise and produces better air quality for people around it. And my ideal hospital will be instead of a city in nature, we would have a hospital in nature by 2028. So on the left-hand side, you can see the woodpecker and the lesser tree duck, and these are actually found in the Alexandra woodland that is just next to AH. So you can see we are quite fortunate to be situated next to the rail corridor and the Alexandra woodland. We have been working with NParks at the Nature Society to try and integrate the rail corridor with the hospital grounds. I think examples of very enlightened use of nature is the Kallang Waterway in Bishan Park and the Sungai Api-Api in Pasir Ris that integrates and retains some of the green elements even while they develop the surrounding areas. So as you can see, the rail corridor is something we like to work on. We like to provide easy access to this lush greenery that we have. NParks are now in discussion with us as to what kind of trees they'll be planting along the portion of the rail corridor that's next to us. So that's quite exciting. We would like to have a canopy to provide thermal comfort for all our staff and patients. So although we do have many trees in AH right now, we would like to see how this can be further improved in the new campus. Healing spaces. Well, vertical gardens are now all in the rage. I can see that being very well done in KTPH. And also there is a hotel called Oasia Hotel in Singapore, which also has a lot of these vertical gardens. It does produce a very healing, calming effect, and as well as providing cooling environment to reduce the amount of heat energy needed to cool the building. Looking into built environment, we are now in the midst of planning for the new campus. So looking into how shade can be provided, how the buildings can be oriented in the north-south direction so that to reduce the effect of the sun and heat up the buildings. And we like to also orientate the buildings to the prevailing wind so that there will be wind going through passageways when the people are walking. Water body forms a heat sink that can retain, which will capture the heat, and when water evaporates, it will make the surrounding area cooler. I know that KTPH has this Yishun pond, which is very nice aesthetically and has a great heat sink effect on the surrounding area. We would like to have that, but I think that is probably not going to happen. But I'll be happy if they have smaller water bodies within the new campus. Here you can see another of these pilot projects that we have undertaken right now in preparation for the new campus. We have actually farmed out, well, we have actually given plots of land for our gardening club. So our members who are interested in it will has actually grown things like brinjal using compost from food waste. So this actually replicate some good practices that are done in hotels and restaurants, where they have farm to table kind of vegetable being used. So we will have the same idea of farm to bedside, reducing the carbon footprint of imported food. Although this will never be commercially viable, but I think it does help to contribute to Singapore's plan to obtain 30% of food grown locally by 2030. And having this on the rooftop serves a dual purpose. So not only do we have this food security issue addressed, but it also will reduce the heat that is retained by the building, and hence reduce the energy that's needed to cool the building. Now, there are other ways to address energy efficiency. So we are in the new building. We are looking into how we can cool the building using this hybrid cooling system. That is a combination of using fan, aircon, and natural ventilation. Now, why are we doing this? Because cooling a building takes up 40 to 50% of energy consumption. And if we can have a more efficient way of cooling our new campus, I think that will be a very big step towards reducing our carbon footprint. Another way of reducing our carbon footprint is to deploy cooling pane on the rooftop and solar panel as well. So by doing this, actually our government has an aim to have 1.5 gigawatts worth of solar power by 2030 generated in Singapore using these solar panels. And if we can do our little bit by deploying solar panels on our new campus, I think that would be a great step ahead. And in doing all this, we could also achieve our the BCA Green Mark Platinum Super Low Energy Standard. Again, this is one of these key performance index that the government has set up to have a certain number of buildings within Singapore to be able to achieve this low energy standard mark. We cannot talk about energy efficiency without talking about electric vehicles. So currently we have 2 electric vehicle charging points in AH. As Singapore moves to phase out fossil fuel based vehicles, we will definitely need more of these EV charging points, and we will have a certain number of car parks that would be equipped with EV charging points for our staff usage. Now this will be my last slide. So my ideal picture of our new campus is to have one that is the green sanctuary filled with beautiful clean waterways that will support rich diverse species, and this would be for the use of our patients, our staff, and our community. Well, with this, thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Weng Ho. Right now, our final speaker for this morning is Prof. Eugene Liu. He was the former CEO of NUH, and before that, our former HOD. And right now, his current role in NUH is he's the Group Director of Strategic Facilities Planning within NUHS, as he's looking to plan our redevelopment of our Cambridge campus. And he's been also working quietly behind the scenes, giving us helpful ideas and linking us with helpful people to see how we could take small steps to go green. And he will deliver the final lecture for this morning entitled "There is No Planet B." Eugene?
Hey, hi. Thanks, Brian, for the introduction, and thanks everyone for being on the Zoom this morning. So you heard from Peiki and Weng Ho, and I'll just share a little bit about some of the organizational aspects and what you can do to decarbonize your practice and also your hospital. I know that some of the leadership of hospitals are online on this call. So the first thing is that there is a a system to climate change and mitigation of its effects. And there is a UN framework for Convention on Climate Change, to which Singapore is a party. And they've been organizing these, what they call conference of the parties that they've had, most recent one in Glasgow last year. Within Singapore itself, there is a inter-ministry effort, and this is led by 5 ministries, led out of the Prime Minister's office, and they're looking at the Singapore Green Plan till 2030. Now, interestingly, if you look at the 5 ministries, healthcare isn't actually one of them, although healthcare is a big generator of greenhouse gases in Singapore. And more recently, last year in July, there has been a Green Gov plan for the government sector that includes all the public healthcare institutions. So we will have to comply with the requirements of this. And as you heard recently, the requirements have been stepped up. So it's going to be a much more ambitious plan going forward. So Wing Ho had shared about Singapore's Green Plan, and then specifically for the Green Gov SG plan, which will affect the public healthcare sector. They've got some targets too. And if you can get this online through the QR code. But if you look at the items on the left, actually public healthcare hospitals would be involved in every single one of these. We've got to reduce energy use, as Wing Ho had mentioned. We've got to reduce the amount of waste, and quite aggressively, just imagine 30% of waste reduction. We've got to set targets for our buildings to become much more energy efficient. And then, of course, in anything new that we build, we will have to be much more energy efficient, not just in the infra, but also in the operations. And that includes all the new hospitals, new polyclinics that are being built in the public sector. So what does it actually mean to decarbonize? Well, that's where we are right now. The estimate is that we are still increasing the country's carbon dioxide output, or greenhouse gas output. It's estimated to peak at 65 megatons a year in 2030. And then the intent was to bring it down by half to 33 megatons in around 2050, and then net zero as soon as possible after that. Well, in fact, that's just been brought much further forward, and the intent is that by 2050, the government would like Singapore to be carbon net zero at that point, not just after, but before, maybe even as early as the 2040s. And so that's going to take a huge change in how the country works, and of course how healthcare works in Singapore. So there's going to be a huge drive ahead to decarbonize healthcare. Yeah. So what does it mean for us? Well, that's the context that we have ahead. I think already we have extreme weather events. There are physical risk, and while it may not threaten you directly, the rising sea levels are a threat to a small country, with a low-lying country like Singapore, and our water supply is going to be at risk if sea levels rise excessively. And of course, if you're living near the equator, the impact of the seawater level rise is going to be much more than if you're in a cooler country. Yeah. For the hospitals, there is a regulatory and requirements, and there are some legal risks if you do not comply. And so this is something we will have to pay attention to. And then, of course, as the ministers had announced, there will be financial impact to the hospitals. For those of you who are in leadership positions, this really is going to impact us. Carbon tax is now $5 a ton of CO2. That's projected to rise perhaps as early as 2024. And the end may be as high as $80 a ton. So in impact, what it means to a hospital like NUH is that you could go from a 6-figure sum of tax to a 9-figure sum of tax, depending on how high the tax eventually goes. In countries like Europe, it's like Switzerland and Sweden, where typically these are sort of reference countries that Singapore uses. They're already charging at the order of over 100 US a ton. So it's actually a big impact. Patient staff, already there are expectations from our staff that we have greener healthcare. Your patients may, and of course your stakeholders might as well. And for those of you working in the private sector, I think listed companies like Parkway and Raffles, in fact, do have ESG requirements that they comply with. Supply chain, I think even before the Ukraine crisis, there really were concerns about supply chain and how vulnerable Singapore might be. So this is something that we will have to study as well. And basically, the whole challenge is to decarbonize within the time frame within a carbon limit and to aim for net zero by 2050. So that's what's ahead of the country. So what do we have to do, healthcare as a whole? Well, two parts. I think the first, you do have to prepare for the impact and the burden of disease that would change with global warming. There might be more vector-borne diseases, there could be contamination of the water supply, and you might have more heat-related illnesses. But secondly, I think healthcare itself has to decarbonize, as we're a pretty big contributor to greenhouse gases. And so aligned with MOH's shift to preventive care and population health, actually changing to greener healthcare is actually a good move. And it is quite aligned with the capitation that was also announced recently. So in future, heads will have to think of triple bottom line, not just of profit or dollars, but you're going to have to think about manpower sustainability, and you also have to think about the planet. So what they call the 3 Ps, people, profit, and planet. And really, this is about Singapore's survival. Many of us, well, most of us, I think, would be certainly not working and not around by 2100, but your grandchildren or even your children may be bearing the impact of global warming and its impact on Singapore. So what can you do in decarbonization? Wing Ho and Peiki had mentioned some things earlier about how you design and your buildings, how you operate your buildings, and also the workflows where you can contribute. But I think the first thing is that you have to get organized, whether in your department, hospital level, to get organized and to have someone accountable. You do need to set meaningful targets related to the carbon footprint, and then to actually track and measure it. So I'll just share a little bit about some of the design features that you can work on, and this concept of embodied carbon in what you procure, and then operating carbon, and a bit about supply chain carbon and how you actually can influence this. And so if you look in this picture here, this is from one of the operating rooms, NUH, and someone has helpfully removed or hidden the desflurane vaporizer. There is the sticker here. Someone added this thing about a guilt trip if you use desflurane. And but the one thing that you can influence quite a bit of, apart from desflurane, is this thing, nitrous oxide. And that's almost as bad. The impact of this actually for NUH is almost as bad in total, or worse actually, as that of desflurane. So in terms of greenhouse gases, this is another big one to address. Well, looking at design of buildings and facilities, it's always nice to build new stuff. But the first thing to think about actually is that the greenest building is the one that you do not build. So avoid overbuilding in the first place. You do have to balance future needs and future-proof your hospital or your clinic, but don't overbuild. Much better to refurbish or repurpose old facilities where practicable instead of demolishing them. And you can always find new uses, such as for non-acute care or even office use for your facilities. Wing Ho had mentioned about passive design, where you use natural airflows, you try to have a north-south orientation, and then you try to reduce the sort of sun exposure to the hospital. You can have sunshades and actually to also use natural light so that you reduce the need for artificial lighting. What will change in future is increasing use of recycled construction material, locally sourced where possible, and then using construction methods that are greener. And so this is a big move that's led by the BCA, and it will become mandatory in future. At the moment, there are concerns, of course, about the strength or durability of a recycled construction material. But so far, the tests have shown actually that sometimes it could actually be stronger than traditional concrete when you have recycled content or aggregate in your concrete. Energy efficient systems are very important. I think there's a lot of talk about solar panels, but in truth, if you look at the high-rise environment of Singapore, at best, you can get 1.5, maybe 2% replacement of energy from solar panels. So really, it's much more impact if you cut your energy use by 10%. And it's often possible to achieve much more than 10%. One last thing is, as you design your buildings and facilities, is try to standardize them as far as possible, enable flexible use. And this concept of sharing, it might be a bit alien to the department cultures in public hospitals, but actually learning to share clinics, not just within the department, but across department, is actually key to having greener buildings and facilities. So planning, life cycle planning, I think we do have to think about embodied carbon in our assets. And I guess think about it when you, at the time of procurement, what you need may not be the same as what you like. but we often get what you like or what you want. But it's worth thinking about it. Do need to consider the total cost of ownership, maintenance costs, and of course the energy use involved. But to take it a step further and think about embodied carbon and operating carbon and the trade-off in these two, it might be worth investing a bit more up at the start in having a greener piece of equipment, but then less energy used later on. And again, the last point, you don't actually need to own everything. Do try to learn to share. Okay? And for those who are involved in planning new hospitals and new facilities, we often plan for the ability to scale up. It's worth thinking about how you can also scale down as the country's population shrinks, its workload may go down in some specialties, or the types of work that we do may change. Okay, so it's worth investing upfront for long-term flexibility, so that there's some lower cost and later expansion. But you can do it in greener ways by having, say, white space or soft space, rather than fully outfitted facilities. And one thing to note is that even as Singapore goes car-light, all those nice car parks that we now have could actually be repurposed. So you might need to have a floor-to-floor height that's adequate in the first place so that you can convert your car park for other users. So just some thoughts for your consideration for those involved in planning hospitals. Now, how you use a building is actually as important as what you build. And there's this concept of stewardship where you use what you have wisely and well. So the first thing is to recognize that space and land are precious, especially in Singapore, and to monitor how the space is actually used. Very important for those heads of department who might be on this call is that do housekeeping to clear out junk. You'd be surprised what you find. And then trust but check. Sometimes when you open a cupboard or you open a room, you'd be surprised what you find inside and how space is actually used. For example, so if you look at this, this is a very spacious clinic, best left unnamed. This was a weekday at 10 a.m. You've got a counter at the end, maybe one patient and a few staff, but you can see that's relatively empty. And you do have to think, is this a sustainable use of space? So trust, but check. Now, operating carbon a little bit further, learning how to share is a key thing, but do review the legacy settings. It's something that we need to work on. There are many settings that we don't change, have not changed for years. And I think Wing Ho mentioned about how much the cooling load cost in energy terms. So the ACMV and OTs, for instance, we keep our OTs running at, I think, something like 20 air changes per hour when we're operating, but also when we're not operating, and right through the weekends. And so that's something perhaps we should start looking at. You can buy the best energy equipment, but if you're operating it with the wrong hours, well, there's a lot more that you can gain. Okay, and then setting of air cons for many of you who have to wear jackets in your rooms to stay warm. Well, there's a Singapore SG Greens 25 degree C drive, so get the right settings in the first place. Yeah, so really, I think as a country, we need to work first on energy efficiency, reducing consumption and reducing waste, rather than chasing renewable energy, because really there isn't the space for this. There's a lot of competing needs for your roof space, and the buildings are too dense anyway. Yeah, and then for those who are managing costs, to look at electricity costs and also the carbon costs. Someone's going to have to pay for all this. May not be us directly, but it may be your grandchildren and children that pay for the costs. Yeah, a little bit more about operating theaters and what you can look at. So it is a high energy consumption area with high waste production, and of course the anesthesia gas impact that Peiki had shared about earlier. So we're very concerned, of course, about infection prevention and air quality. It's crucial, but you can check your temperature settings, your air change settings, and how much you really need to lower the humidity and so on. Yeah. Currently, the practice is to cool the fresh air below the dew point to dehumidify it, and then you rewarm it. So actually, that's a very energy-intensive process, and that's typically how the operating theaters work. And so cooling the fresh air, if you can reduce the number of air changes when the OT is not being used, when it's empty at night or over the weekends, you could have significant savings there. But it will take a mindset change and some studies to look at how the air quality, microbial counts are not compromised. For newer OTs, there are some setback settings, but in truth, these don't actually save that much. And there are heat recovery systems so that for this part about rewarming the air after it's been dehumidified, there is the use of a heat recovery system to try and save a little bit of energy there, but you're probably getting at best 10% reduction here. So much more research is needed in this area. Yeah. how to reduce the energy consumption in the OTs. Now, for anesthesia gases, there's been a lot of mention about capture of volatiles to prevent, well, firstly, to prevent the release into the atmosphere, and then secondly, how to reuse the volatiles if possible. But it's not clear at the moment whether that whole industrial process of capturing, of purifying or cleansing it, and then packaging it for reuse is in fact green or not green. So it's not clear at this time. Yeah, and it's certainly not available to most hospitals. Yeah, a little small thing that you might want to look at is your anesthesia gas scavenging system. You can actually turn this off when the OTs are not in use. It will reduce wear and tear on your pumps in the first instance, as well as save some energy. And you might actually save 60% or up to 60% or even more of the energy consumption here, not to mention the wear and tear and the need to replace it. What else can you influence in the operating theaters? Well, anesthesia, if you look at it, is a big deal. It's 10% of the hospital's scope 1 and 2 carbon emissions. This is what it's counted and considered by the government. So looking at direct emissions on site or your purchase electricity. And most of the scope 1 in a hospital is your desflurane and nitrous oxide. So as Peiki had said, please reconsider desflurane and also reconsider whether you want to use nitrous oxide as a carrier gas, change to TVAR and so on. But we do need alternatives. And I think one area where nitrous oxide there still is a challenge is what to do for labor analgesia. What to stock? Not all items are created equal. So even for something like sevoflurane, there are greener ways of producing sevoflurane with less embodied carbon in the process. So that's something that you can check for. And you do need transparency from your vendors for this. Yeah. And the less plastic you use, the better, because it stays in the system forever. We can look at how we use devices. So single-use versus reusable devices versus actually reusing some devices. And so laryngoscope blades, such as the plastic single-use blades, well, when we first started having these blades, they were very precious. We actually washed and cleaned them and reused them again. We don't now. Same with breathing circuits. Certainly when I started anesthesia, a breathing circuit could be used for 1 year without being changed. And that was even without HMEFs. But now it's single-use very often. And then Hudson masks. Maybe after COVID, we want to look at reviewing some of this. The UK NHS has moved way ahead, and they've looked at recycling even metal components, recycling the sharps boxes. Maybe a below extreme, but something you can also think about and work on. We'll need the vendors on board for this. And some companies are already starting recycling processes for their single-use devices. Yeah. So you do need greener industrial processes. It's not something that we can do on our own, but we need to work with the vendors on this, the suppliers, and to look at the carbon impact on drugs and items so we actually understand what our carbon load is. Wing Ho had mentioned a little bit about cooling the buildings. This is NUH. This is the Kenwich wing. The MRT is in this building, which is the medical center block. But some women may be familiar with this. This is the roof of the Kenwich Wing Women's Clinic, and it's a metal roof. And if you take a temperature of it on a typical day, this is at 11 a.m. on a sort of cloudy day, it's actually very, very hot. It's 56.5 degrees. And you can just imagine what that does to the cooling load of the air underneath this roof. There's quite a bit of insulation, but it's still, it's noticeably warmer in that clinic than in other areas. So white paint can actually reduce temperature substantially, by as much as 30 degrees, with the internal temperature falling by 7 degrees. That's a big deal, 7 degrees drop. And this is something that Ban Ki-moon, former UN SecGen, had been pushing, looking at how, days of old, these old buildings, whitewash was a very sensible idea to try and reduce the heat load. So Singapore's been trying this, HDB's been trying this. This is quite near Singapore General Hospital. This is Bukit Permai, where they've tried 2 blocks in a sort of controlled trial, where normal paint was applied to the roofs of this block of flats, and cool paint was applied to the roofs here. And they found quite a substantial difference in the roof, as well as in the under the roof, the temperature was definitely cooler when you had cool paint. And they're expanding the study to other sites, other HDB sites in Singapore. I think Tampines Estate is working on this now. So this may become the norm going forward. So one area that you can really control is from emails. This is the sort of carbon footprint that we may not think about, but actually it's quite important. So one email is about 4 grams of carbon dioxide. May not seem like much, but when you add an attachment to it, a 4 megabyte email, you starts to become a bit more significant. So if you send a photo to your friends, that's 50 grams of CO2 each. Now, if you send mass emails, as in some big departments do, and you send it to 100 people in the department, that's going to be 5 kilograms of CO2e, or the equivalent of driving your car for 16 kilometers. And this gets forwarded and forwarded on. You can imagine the number of kilometers does add up. So you can take stock. How much email traffic is generated in your department? My guess is not many of us know. So, but we can reduce our mass emails, can reduce repeated mass emails, or certainly avoid using the mass reply all functions. So there are basic email etiquette things like using BCC, reducing the size of attached files and so on. Actually, they're not only good for email etiquette to actually reduce your carbon load. And we often share large files on email. Presentations, for instance, are often sent out by email. What you can do is actually store them on a shared drive, and those who really want the files can go there to download it. It also stops jamming up your email account. And so we mentioned housekeeping of your facilities earlier, so you should email housekeeping of your email accounts too, and store on your computer, not on the server. And one small thing is to turn off your computers after work, because even sleep mode consumes as much as 30% of the running energy cost. What else can you decarbonize? Quite a lot, actually. So there's been a lot of information earlier about volatile anesthetics, especially for desflurane. But you can actually look at the rest of your supply chain. You will need the vendors to be transparent about this, but to address not only the price and quality, but also the environmental impact. Green Gulf SG is very particular now about paper, bottled water, and plastic bags. But perhaps one area not so salient, seeing that we're still in COVID, has been food and buffets. And the estimate is that all that catered food at CME events and so on, as much as 30 to 40% of it is wasted. It's not actually consumed, it's wasted. And that goes to incineration and landfill, typically. Another area that you do procure and can control is business air travel. And we've all learned from COVID that you can actually get by, just like at this meeting with teleconferencing, with a Zoom meeting. Yeah. But this is a big area. And I think for a typical hospital, it could be as much as 1% or 2% of your carbon footprint is business air travel. People love traveling, of course, when it's on drug company sponsored travel, but ultimately the cost is passed back to your hospitals. And conference travel carbon way exceeds the total staff daily commuting carbon that you incur from coming to work. So this is a big deal. Yeah. So be careful of conflicts of interest, and there's no such thing as a free lunch. And even the pens that are given out free from the desflurane makers, well, the cost is passed back to you in some way. A bit more about waste. These are Singapore's priorities in waste. I think one of the very, very pressing priorities to reduce. We don't have enough landfill space, so we have to reduce the amount that is sent to the landfill so that it can last beyond 2035. Wing Ho had mentioned about food waste. That's a big deal. That's probably 8 to 10% of the waste in the hospital on a typical day. And then e-waste, that's important too. And then packaging waste. So OTs are big producers of waste. So in NUH, OTs take up about 5% of the space in the hospital, but we produce easily over 30% of the hospital's waste. So it is a big deal. And we recycle typically 2% of all waste. So this has to change. And we need to recycle. We also need to recycle smartly. And that's what happens when staff recycle or are not taught to recycle properly. This is in the paper recycling bin, but you can see that's what looks like rubbish that's been put in. So we do need to teach our people how to recycle properly and to encourage and to track this. Yeah. The last couple of steps, I think getting going to decarbonize. I think the first thing is to set an ethos of stewardship and to treat carbon as a precious resource. Just like you treat manpower, space, and money as a resource, treat carbon as one too. You do need to study and teach the next generation. And for the examiners online, well, can this be part of the syllabus and training? Does it need to be in the syllabus before you can examine it? Should it be part of the MET or the exit exam that's coming up quite soon? Yeah. In a department, you will need a team, and you do need to support the team, and you need accountability. And looking at the big corporations now, like Capital Land, like SGX, and so on, their bonuses are impacted by whether they achieve environmental goals or not just financial, but environmental goals. The main things that we have to recognize, it can't be business as usual as a specialty and as a healthcare system. And really pointing fingers at others or pointing fingers at other specialties is not going to help, okay? Or pointing fingers at other countries is not going to work either. So we will have to do whatever we can, okay? There are risks involved, as mentioned, so physical transition risks, legal and financial impact as well. And carbon tax is going to change. It is going to hit the country, not just in healthcare, but also in all aspects of your life. And there might be this other concept of import or border taxes. So that's on all the embodied carbon in what you buy. So this may all come in. Yeah. Where you can start decarbonization, I think a good start's always looking at energy. So improved efficiency and reduce waste, and some very basic good practices. You can look at your supply chain, and I think mapping it and quantifying it is the first step. So getting your vendors and suppliers on board is important. You do have influence on this, and just to be aware of vested interests and prevent conflicts of interest from sponsorship. And then in your OTs, in recycling in OTs, recycling smartly in the OTs and reducing waste going to incinerator and landfill, that's very, very important. And you can focus on the packaging, the paper, and the glass. Yeah. So you do need to set targets so that you can track how close you're getting to net zero, or at least 50% reduction. How much do you use electricity? The BCA metric is to look at energy use intensity, or EUI, looking at your kilowatt hours per meter squared per year. How much waste do you generate? Do we know? How many kilos per day? And how much do you recycle of that as a percentage of your total waste? And then this little thing about public transport, going car light in Singapore. How many staff commute to public transport, commute to work by public transport? My guess is that many of us on this call don't use public transport to get to work. How much greenhouse gases do we produce from pedestrian? Well, you can actually calculate that from the volatiles and from the nitrous oxide. It can all be done. But even as we do all this, you need to be careful of greenwashing and wayang. So don't wayang what you've not actually achieved or try to get away with doing more. Yeah. So I'll end here, but really, I think we can't carry on the way we are. You do have to care about it. And if you look at Singapore, this is a sort of heat map of Singapore, looking at the urban heat island effect. And if you take a more micro view of this plan, you can see that the hospitals are very hot spots. Yeah, they're in red. So we need to change. So I'll end here and hand over to Brian. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Eugene and Wenko and Becky. We've actually exceeded our time by a bit, so I think we are just going to take one or two questions from the floor. In the Q&A section, I think I shall direct this question to Eugene. As both the former CEO and the former HOD, there's always this drive towards single-use healthcare products because of a perceived sterility and patient safety. So what is your answer to the surgeons who want to, or to the nurses who I note in the ward have now gone to disposable drug trays? So how did that come into being, and how can we stop that?
It's a good point, and it's the considerations here were not just about, or consideration here for us, it's about the carbon. The wide consideration would be on the manpower available to process and to clean, reprocess, and that's difficult. We're very short of manpower to actually do that kind of sterilization work. The second, of course, is that sterilization itself is energy intensive, and I think it's still better than producing a product from scratch, but it is energy intensive to clean it and to make sure that it's cleaned properly. So it is a tight balance. I think the main consideration was, do we have the manpower to be able to clean it? And if we don't, then we don't have a choice but to go to single-use items. One last thing, of course, I guess in this time of COVID, I think everyone's a little bit sensitive about reusing devices, especially even breathing circuits. Although the logic, we can look at it. We don't change a breathing circuit between patients in a typical day, but we change it before the patient the next day. So something that we can study the logic of.
Yeah, we actually have got a plan to change it weekly now, but this we wrote to infectious diseases and they said we were on the brink of a surge in cases, and they said maybe we should shelve this for later on.
Yeah.
So,
we have to take the context into account. So yeah, it's something you can look at. It's when this COVID business is settled.
Yeah. Then and I just would like to ask Peggy, is there a one sentence answer to Shihau's question about what is our carbon footprint in my daily practice? Is there a simple way to quantify it? Because there are syringes, there are syringe pumps, there are vaporizers, and there are the volatiles. I mean, we talk about Tiva being greener, but do we talk about the CO2 involved in producing these plastic and tubings and syringe pumps?
Yeah, so sorry, I'm just outside now, but yes, the life cycle assessment study that I shared with everybody earlier on does include the plastic involved, including the line extensions and the syringes. Tiva is definitely more environmentally friendly than sevoflurane and desflurane. 1 kilogram compared to 3 kilograms of CO2. And I think but it may become a little bit more blunt, especially when you are talking about recycling sevoflurane in the future and once these gases are fit for use. How are you going to measure your CO2e on a day-to-day basis in terms of your anesthesia practice? There is actually no easy answer to this. So in terms of your volatile agents, I think I shared with everybody the anesthesia impact calculator earlier on, which can download from the App Store. So I think that itself will allow you to see how much CO2e you are generating from anesthesia gases alone. But in terms of the amount of the syringes for IV drugs and all those things, those require a life cycle assessment to look at how much CO2e you are generating. People have actually done studies on this, and it's actually quite significantly lower compared to the inhalational gases that we use. But I think for reference sake, if you do want a simple analogy, 1 kilogram of plastic will generate about 6 kilograms of CO2e in its life cycle, whereas 1 kilogram of paper will generate about 3 kilograms of CO2e during that cycle when you incinerate it. Recycling actually reduces the amount of CO2e that's produced. But yes, if you want an in-depth calculation, it's not going to be an easy process.
Okay, thanks, Becky. So it's about just past 10:45. I think I'm just going to draw this meeting to a close, and I think the take-home message we all should get from this is what Eugene said. The greenest building is a building that hasn't been built. And here we are actually talking about, let's save the earth for our children. But the greenest thing we could do is actually to have fewer children, because humans are consumers. So we could go with Tiva, we could go with vegetarian, we could all go around like almost naked and, you know, and use the fans and all. But we have to put things into perspective. We do have to live our lives. So all we are just advocating is just to put a bit of mindfulness in our daily activities and daily practice, and just to ask yourself, do I really need to do this? You know, and you can even ask yourself simple questions like, what's the carbon cost of a full blood count? You know, what's the carbon cost of a blood gas? When I'm with juniors in the OT, they would ask me, should we check a blood gas before we transfer the patient out? And my question is why? And their answer is because we have an outline. But so then my answer to them is next time we don't put in the outline so that there will be no temptation to check a blood gas. So, and this just leads on and on. So we just need to balance patient safety with what we've been taught to do and to what we actually need doing. Okay, and it's just food for thought as we go about starting the weekend of hopefully not over consuming. So with this, I'd like to thank Edwin, the college, the SSA for the invitation to come and speak, to Joseph and Barina for their technical support, as well as to our esteemed panelists, and to the 110 people who are logged in for this call. Bear in mind that if you didn't turn on your video, you would actually have saved some carbon as well. And I would like to thank everyone and wish you a very good weekend. Thank you.